What would you do if someone handed you a key to a place everyone else had given up on? Not a mansion, not a dream home, a broken, rotting, forgotten cabin at the end of a dirt road that hadn't seen a car in 11 years. A place where the roof had caved in on one side, where the windows were black with grime, where animals had moved in and made themselves comfortable in the rooms where a family had once eaten dinner and laughed and loved. A place that cost exactly $1 because nobody else wanted it. Nathan Cole was 34 years old, broke, recently divorced, and sleeping on his brother's couch when someone handed him that key. He almost didn't take it, but he did. And what he found inside that cabin, not just in the walls, but in himself, in his history, in the story of a family he never knew he had, would change everything. Stay with me, because this story starts in the rubble and ends somewhere you will not expect.
Nathan Cole had not always been the kind of man who slept on his brother's couch. There had been a time, not so long ago really, just 3 years back, when he had a house with a proper guest room and a kitchen with granite countertops and a driveway where 2 cars sat side by side like a photograph of a life going according to plan. He had a wife named Serena, a job as a mid-level project manager at a construction firm, a savings account that wasn't large but was growing, a future that looked, from the outside, entirely reasonable. Then, in the span of 14 months, all of it came apart. The construction firm lost a major contract and downsized. Nathan was not the first to go, but he was not the last. He came home on a Thursday afternoon carrying a small cardboard box of desk items, a coffee mug, a framed photo, a stress ball he had never once squeezed, and Serena met him at the door with an expression that told him she had been waiting for an opening. The marriage had been struggling for longer than either of them had admitted. Nathan's long hours and frequent travel, Serena's growing distance, her increasing evenings out, the careful way she had begun to speak to him, as though measuring every word for damage. They had been 2 people maintaining the appearance of a partnership long after the partnership itself had quietly dissolved. The layoff was not the cause of the divorce, but it was the moment that made pretending impossible. Serena moved out in March. The house went on the market in May. The mortgage was more than Nathan could carry alone, and the equity split, after fees and the remaining balance, left him with less than he had hoped and more debt than he'd expected. By August, he was on his brother's couch. Marcus Cole was 2 years older than Nathan, a high school history teacher with a patient wife named Deanna and 3 kids under the age of 10. Their house was not large. The couch was not comfortable. The walls were thin enough that Nathan could hear every morning at 6 the specific symphony of a family waking up, cartoons, cereal, someone crying about a missing shoe, and feel, in a complicated way, both grateful and devastated. He was grateful because Marcus had not hesitated, had simply said, "You come here, you stay as long as you need, we figure it out together." He was devastated because he was 34 years old, and this was not supposed to be his life. He spent the first month applying for jobs. The market was difficult. His field was competitive. He had interviews that went well and then went nowhere. And the particular silence of waiting for callbacks that don't come has a weight to it that settles in the chest and stays. He spent the second month trying not to spiral. He went on walks. He helped Deanna with the kids when he could. He read books he found in Marcus's shelves, history mostly, because Marcus had hundreds of history books, and Nathan had always been the kind of person who could lose himself in a good story about people who survived things. He was on one of those walks on a gray October afternoon when his phone rang. The caller was a woman named Ruth Elmore. He had never heard of Ruth Elmore.
"Is this Nathan Cole?" the woman asked. Her voice was elderly, careful and precise, the voice of someone who had learned to choose words with intention. "It is," Nathan said. "Nathan Cole, son of David Cole, grandson of Robert and Eleanor Cole?" Nathan stopped walking. His grandfather Robert had died before Nathan was born. His grandmother Eleanor had died when Nathan was 6, a vague, soft memory of a small woman with white hair and a house that smelled like cinnamon. His father David had passed away 4 years ago, a heart attack at 61, quick and shocking, and still not fully processed. "Yes," Nathan said slowly. "Who is this?" "My name is Ruth Elmore. I'm an estate attorney in Harlan County, Kentucky. Mr. Cole, I've been trying to locate you for several months. You are listed as the sole heir to a property belonging to your grandmother's estate, a property that was held in a trust that has only recently been released." Nathan stood on the sidewalk in the gray October afternoon and listened. "The property," Ruth Elmore explained, "was a cabin located on 12 acres of land in eastern Kentucky mountains, in a hollow about 4 miles off the main road. The cabin had been built in 1941 by Nathan's great-grandfather, a man named Elias Cole. It had passed to Eleanor upon Elias's death, and Eleanor, for reasons the attorney could not fully explain, had placed it in a restricted trust with instructions that it not be transferred until 30 years after her death. Eleanor Cole had died in 1994. 30 years had passed in October of this year. The property, Ruth Elmore said, has been unoccupied for approximately 31 years. I must be transparent with you, Mr. Cole. It is not in good condition. The county assessor valued it at $1 for tax purposes, which is essentially a legal acknowledgement that the structure itself has negative value. The land has some worth, but the cabin would need to be demolished or extensively rehabilitated." $1? Nathan repeated. "Yes. Now, you are under no obligation to accept the property. There are costs associated with the transfer, legal fees, back taxes that have accumulated, which I can outline for you, and you may find that declining is the more practical choice. Many people in your situation—" "I'll take it," Nathan said. There was a pause. "Mr. Cole, I would encourage you to see the property before—" "I'll take it," he said again. "Whatever it costs to transfer, I'll take it." He wasn't sure, standing there on that sidewalk, why he was so certain. He would understand later. Marcus thought he was making a mistake. "Nathan," he said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the careful expression of an older brother who has learned to deliver concern without condescension, "you're talking about sinking money you don't have into a property that a professional assessor valued at $1. You understand that, right?" "I understand that." "The back taxes alone, $1,100. I have it. Barely, but I have it. And then what? You drive out to the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, and look at a building that's been falling apart for 30 years, and then what?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "It's family. It's the only thing left that belonged to my family. My grandfather built it. My grandmother lived in it. I never knew either of them, Marcus. Dad never talked about it. This is—I don't know what it is, but I'm not going to just let it go." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Take my truck. The suspension is better for mountain roads." The drive from Nashville to Harlan County took just under 4 hours. Nathan drove with the windows cracked, even though it was November and cold, because the air coming off the mountains had a quality to it, sharp and clean and old, that he wanted to breathe directly. He had looked up what little he could find about his great-grandfather Elias Cole. Not much existed online. A census record from 1940 listing him as a coal miner in Harlan County, a marriage certificate to a woman named May Sutton in 1938, a death record from 1971. His grandmother Eleanor had been their daughter. She had left Kentucky in the 1960s, married Robert Cole, and built a life in Tennessee. She had apparently never sold the cabin, never returned to it as far as Nathan could discover. But she had held on to it, had placed it in a trust with specific instructions. Why? Nathan wondered, as the mountains rose around him and the highway narrowed and the landscape became something older and quieter and more deliberate. What was she keeping it for? He met Ruth Elmore at her office in Harlan at 2 p.m. She was exactly as her voice suggested, a small, precise woman in her 70s with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the organized calm of someone who had been handling other people's complicated matters for decades. She gave him the paperwork. He signed. He paid the back taxes and the transfer fees. She handed him a key, old, heavy, iron, the kind of key that belongs to a specific era, and a hand-drawn map to the property. The road is unpaved, passable in dry weather. Given the rain we've had this week, I'd advise caution. Has anyone been out there recently? Ruth Elmore hesitated just briefly, a small hesitation that he might have missed if he hadn't been watching. Not officially, she said. There is some local lore about the property, stories. You may encounter some of that if you speak to people in town. What kind of stories? She looked at him over her glasses. The kind that accumulate around old, abandoned places. She said it in the precise way of someone who has not quite answered the question.
The road to the cabin was exactly as Ruth Elmore had described, unpaved, narrow, recently muddy, threading through woods that grew closer on both sides until it felt less like a road and more like a suggestion. Nathan drove slowly. Tree branches scraped the roof of the truck. The GPS lost signal after the second mile, and he navigated by the hand-drawn map, which Ruth Elmore had annotated with landmarks. Large split oak on left, bear right at creek crossing, look for stone wall. He found the stone wall, low, old, running along the left side of the road for about 50 yards, built from flat gray stones with the careful intention of hands that no longer existed, and turned where the map indicated. And then he saw it. The cabin sat in a clearing that the forest had been slowly reclaiming for 30 years. The trees had advanced from all sides, their roots buckled beneath the ground, their branches reaching over the structure as though examining it with long, curious fingers. The clearing itself was thick with tall, dead grass and the dried stalks of things that had grown wild and ungoverned through many summers. The cabin was one story, low and long, built from hand-hewn logs that were dark with age and weather. The roof had partially collapsed on the right side, a catastrophic failure, likely from a heavy snow load at some point, and a tarp, ancient and shredded, had been placed over the damage long ago and had since become as broken as what it was meant to protect. The porch, a wide front porch with the remnants of 2 rocking chairs, skeletal and gray, had partially detached from the main structure and tilted toward the ground at an angle. 2 windows on either side of the front door, both intact, both so clouded with grime and age that they were opaque. The front door was closed.
Nathan sat in the truck for a long moment, looking at it. He was not, by nature, a man who was easily moved. He had spent years in construction management, a field that required a specific kind of unsentimental practicality, the ability to look at a structure and see not what it was, but what it could become or needed to be. But sitting in his brother's truck, looking at this broken and beautiful and improbably surviving cabin, he felt something move in him, something that had no practical language. He got out of the truck. The air was cold and smelled of pine and damp earth, and something else, something woodsy and ancient that he didn't have a name for. His boots were immediately wet from the grass. He walked toward the porch slowly, testing each step. He put the key in the lock. It turned. The inside of the cabin was both worse and better than he'd expected. Worse because 31 years of abandonment had done what abandonment does. The ceiling on the right side had come in with the roof, and that entire corner was open to the sky, the collapsed timbers creating a debris pile of wood and insulation, and the nests of animals who had moved in through the gap. The floor in that corner was soft and dark with moisture and the particular rot that comes from years of rain. Better because the rest of it, the left 2/3 of the main room, the small hallway, and the 2 back rooms, was structurally intact in a way that surprised him. The logs were solid. The floor was old, wide plank wood, dirty and warped in places, but fundamentally sound. The stone fireplace that dominated the left wall was intact, its chimney apparently uncompromised. Someone had built this cabin to last. Elias Cole had been a coal miner, but he had built like a craftsman. He moved through the space carefully, cataloging with the professional habit of years. He knocked on walls, tested floorboards, looked at the ceiling joists in the sound section and found them solid, the wood having dried and hardened over decades into something almost stone-like. The cabin was 2 rooms at the back, a bedroom and what had been a kitchen, though the kitchen had been stripped of whatever appliances it once held, leaving only the marks on the floor where a stove and refrigerator had stood. There was a hand pump at the kitchen sink. Nathan pumped it twice and was startled when, after a moment of reluctance, water came out, brown at first, then clearing. The well was still active. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, hand still on the pump, listening to the silence of the place. It was a particular kind of silence, the kind that has weight, that has history in it. He turned and looked at the walls. The kitchen walls were covered in the remnants of old wallpaper, a pattern of small blue flowers on a cream background, faded almost to nothing, peeling in long, slow curls. Underneath, visible where the paper had already fallen, was bare plank wood. Nathan reached out and touched the wall. The plank was loose. He pressed it. It moved. Not a structural failure, not rot, but a deliberate looseness, a plank that had been placed without being fully secured. He looked at it more carefully. The plank had no nails on its right side, only on its left. It was hinged. Nathan's hands had gone very still. He gripped the edge of the plank and pulled. It swung open like a small door. Behind it, in the wall cavity, was a tin box.
The tin was old, deep green, the color faded and spotted with rust at the corners, but intact. It was approximately the size of a shoebox, sealed with a small latch that had no lock. Nathan lifted it out of the wall. It was heavier than he expected. He carried it to the kitchen table, a small square table, scarred and stained, that had survived the decades, and set it down. He stood there for a moment. He was aware, suddenly, of the silence of the place, of the weight of the mountains around it,
of the distance between this hidden room and every other moment of his life. He opened the latch. Inside the tin box, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from the moisture and decades, were a stack of letters, perhaps 40 of them, tied with a piece of kitchen string that had gone brittle. The envelopes were yellowed, the handwriting on the fronts faded but legible. A small leather journal, cracked at the spine, with the initials E.C. tooled into the cover. 3 photographs, black and white, formal, the stiff portrait style of an earlier era. A folded document, official-looking, with a notarial seal. And beneath all of it, wrapped separately in a piece of velvet that once was deep red and was now a faded rose, a brass key, larger and more ornate than the iron key that opened the cabin door. Nathan picked up the leather journal first. He opened it. The handwriting inside was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had not had the luxury of much formal education, but who had taught themselves to write with intention. The first entry was dated March 12, 1943. I am writing this down because some things must not be lost. May says I am foolish to keep records. I say some truths are heavier than fear. This land, this place, this story, it belongs to what comes after us. I am writing it for them. Nathan sat down at the kitchen table in the cold, broken cabin and began to read. The journal of Elias Cole was not a daily diary. It was more than that, a deliberate record written in chunks across several years of a man who had decided that certain things needed to be remembered. Elias Cole had been born in 1910 in Harlan County, Kentucky, the son of a farmer who lost his land in the economic collapse of the early 1920s. He had gone into the coal mines at 14, the way boys in Harlan County went into coal mines because there was nothing else and the family needed to eat. He had worked underground for 9 years. Then, in 1933, something happened. Elias wrote about it carefully, in the measured language of a man choosing every word. There was a collapse in the number 4 shaft, 7 men. I was not there that day because I had a fever and had been sent home by the foreman, the only time in 9 years I had ever left work early. The 7 men did not come out. 3 of them were my friends. 1 of them had a new baby at home. After the collapse, I could not go back, not from fear. I had never been afraid of the dark or the depth, but from something else, something I did not have a word for then. I understand now it was grief and the particular madness that grief produces when you survive something and the others don't. I left the mines. I did not know what else I would do. I had no land and no trade and no money. But I had my hands, and I had the mountains, which I knew better than I knew anything else. I walked for 3 days into the back country. I found this hollow. I found this piece of land, 40 acres then, owned by a man named Garrett who had inherited it and never wanted it. I asked him what he wanted for it. He laughed at me. I told him I could clear timber from the creek section and build the fence he'd been talking about for 10 years. He said if I did that, he'd give me 12 acres and call it square. It took me 2 years, but at the end of 2 years, this land was mine. Nathan read slowly. He was not aware of the cold anymore, or of the time, or of anything outside this table and this journal and the careful handwriting of a man who had been dead for 50 years. Elias wrote about building the cabin. He wrote about May Sutton, whom he had met at a church social in 1937 and married in 1938, whom he described as the finest person I have ever known, which is a large thing to say, and I mean every word of it. He wrote about Eleanor's birth in 1940,
about the way a child changes everything, reorders all the furniture of a life. And then, in an entry dated November 1944, he wrote about something else.
I must write this carefully. I must be precise, because precision is what this deserves. In the summer of 1944, I was clearing brush from the eastern edge of the property, the section near the old creek bed which had shifted course sometime before I came here and left a dry channel running through the far corner of the land. I was clearing the dry creek bed because I had plans to plant there. The soil in a dried creek bed is rich. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something that was not soil and was not rock. I dug carefully. It took most of the afternoon. What I found I will not describe in full here, not because I am ashamed of it, but because I do not want these words to be read by the wrong person at the wrong time. I will say this: it was old, it was significant, and it told a story about this land, about who was here before me, before Garrett, before any deed or claim or legal designation that changed the way I understood where I was standing. I covered it back. I marked the place with 3 stones in a line, which I will describe to Eleanor when she is old enough. I made a decision that day that May agreed with after I told her. We would not sell. We would not report it. We would keep this land, and we would keep this secret, and we would pass both of them to our children, who would understand what to do with them when the time was right. The time, I believe, is not now. Perhaps it will not be in my lifetime, but it will come. Nathan looked up from the journal. Outside the opaque windows, the light had changed. It was later than he realized. The afternoon had gone. His hands were cold. He looked at the stack of letters, at the photographs, at the folded document with its notarial seal, at the ornate brass key wrapped in faded red velvet. He looked at the plank wall where the tin box had been hidden for, he calculated quickly, possibly 80 years. He thought about his grandmother, Eleanor, who had left Kentucky and built a life elsewhere, who had never sold this land, who had placed it in a trust with instructions that it not be transferred until 30 years after her death. She had been waiting for someone from the family to come back, and for 30 years after her death, the cabin had waited too. The letters were from Eleanor to someone named Thomas Aiken. Nathan had never heard of Thomas Aiken. He read them in order, carefully, in the fading light of the cabin. The letters spanned a decade, from 1962 to 1972. Eleanor's voice in them was different from any version of her Nathan might have imagined. Urgent, precise, occasionally frustrated, always passionate. She was writing to an academic. Thomas Aiken was an archaeologist, a professor at the University of Kentucky, who had written a paper on pre-colonial settlement patterns in eastern Kentucky mountains. Eleanor had read the paper, and she had written to him because of what her father had told her before he died. Professor Aiken, the first letter began, "My name is Eleanor Cole. My father was Elias Cole of Harlan County. Before he died last year, he told me something that I believe you need to know. He found something on our family property in 1944, something significant. He chose not to report it, for reasons I understand, though I am not certain I agree with. I am writing to you because the time has come to understand what it is." The correspondence that followed was extraordinary. Thomas Aiken had visited the property in 1963. Eleanor had met him there. She had traveled back to Kentucky from Tennessee for the purpose. She described the visit in a letter written afterward. "He spent 3 days. He was careful and methodical and said very little until he had seen everything. On the third day, he sat with me on the porch and told me what he believed we had found. He used words I had to look up afterward. He was measured, as academics are, careful not to claim more than the evidence supports, but underneath the careful language, I could see that he was, the word I keep coming back to is moved. He was moved. He said, "Mrs. Cole, what is on this land is part of a story that has not been fully told. It belongs to people who were here long before your family, long before any European settlement in this region. The question of what to do with it is not a simple one. It is not yours to give away, and it is not mine to take, but it must not be lost." I asked him what we should do. He said, "Wait, keep the land, find the right people to tell. The time for telling will come, but it must be the right time, with the right understanding." I asked him how I would know when that was. He said, "You will know, or someone after you will." Nathan put the letter down. He sat in the cold cabin in the dark. He hadn't noticed the dark coming, and now it was fully night outside. And he thought about Eleanor Cole, a woman who had left these mountains and built a life elsewhere, who had never, not once, let go of this piece of ground, who knew something was here, who spent her life waiting for the right moment, who, finally, placed everything in a trust and trusted time itself to carry it forward, to whoever came next. He picked up the folded document with the notarial seal. He unfolded it. It was a deed, not a standard property deed, a document prepared by Thomas Aiken and notarized in 1965, describing in careful academic language the location and nature of what Elias Cole had found in 1944. Nathan read it slowly. Then he read it again.
He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the cabin with a flashlight he found in the glove compartment of Marcus's truck, reading everything in the tin box twice. The document, the letters, the journal, looking at the photographs, formal portraits of people he didn't know, his own blood, faces carrying the particular gravity of people who understood that photographs were serious things. By 3 in the morning, he understood the shape of it. In 1944, Elias Cole had found, in the dry creek bed on the eastern edge of his property, evidence of a settlement. Not a European settlement, a pre-colonial settlement, artifacts, structural remnants, and a burial site that Thomas Aiken, in his careful academic language, had described as potentially significant to the understanding of the region's indigenous history. A site that, if properly excavated and researched, could contribute to the documented history of the people who had lived in these mountains long before coal mines and logging roads and property deeds. Elias had covered it, not from malice, but from a mixture of things, a sense that he had no idea what to do with it, a fear of what would happen to the land if outsiders became involved, a deep mountain suspicion of anything that brought government or officials or decisions made by people from somewhere else. Eleanor had spent her adult life trying to find the right path forward. The correspondence with Thomas Aiken had helped her understand what was there. But Aiken had died in 1971, and his cautious advice, wait for the right time, had left her holding something enormous without a clear direction. She had held on to the land. She had waited. She had, eventually, done the only thing she could think of, put it in trust, attached no instructions beyond the 30-year delay, and trusted whoever came after her to figure out what she could not. She had trusted her family. Nathan stood up and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the dark mountains and thought about what it meant to be trusted with something you didn't know you were carrying.
He thought about Elias in the creek bed with his shovel, hitting something unexpected, about May agreeing to the decision without hesitation, about Eleanor writing careful letters to an academic, trying to find the right path. He thought about his father, David, who had never mentioned any of this, who had perhaps not known, who had died before the trust expired. And he thought about himself, sleeping on a couch, broke, unmoored, driving out to a broken cabin in the mountains on an impulse he couldn't fully explain. He understood the impulse now. He had been called here, not in any mystical sense, simply in the sense that this had always been waiting for someone from the family to come, and he was the one who came. The next question was what to do with it. Nathan drove back to Nashville the next morning. He sat Marcus down that evening and told him everything. Marcus, the history teacher, listened without interrupting. When Nathan finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Nathan," he said, "do you understand what you're describing?" "I think so." "You're describing a potentially significant archaeological site on private land, with a documented history going back to 1944, with correspondence from an academic who visited the site, with a deed-like document describing the location." "Yes." "And your plan is to go back, to do it right, to find the right people." Nathan paused, the way Eleanor was trying to, the way Elias always meant to finish what they started. Marcus Cole, history teacher, older brother, man with a patient wife and 3 kids and a couch that he had offered without hesitation, leaned forward and said, "Tell me what you need." The next 6 months were unlike anything Nathan had experienced. He went back to the cabin. He went back many times. He brought materials, basic weatherproofing, tarps that actually worked, plywood to cover the open roof section until he could do more. He was not going to let the cabin deteriorate further. He contacted the University of Kentucky's archaeology department. It took 4 emails and 2 phone calls to reach a professor named Dr. Clara Osei, who specialized in pre-colonial settlement patterns in the eastern United States. He described carefully what he had found. He sent photographs of the document Thomas Aiken had prepared. There was a pause on the phone line. "Mr. Cole," Dr. Osei said, "where exactly is this property?" He told her. Another pause. "Harlan County," she said, almost to herself. "Thomas Aiken's unpublished notes. We've known for years that he had visited a site in Harlan County in the early 1960s. His papers reference it repeatedly, without ever specifying the location. He died before he published anything definitive." "He visited my family's property," Nathan said. "My grandmother corresponded with him for a decade." The longest pause yet. "Mr. Cole," Dr. Osei said, and her voice was careful in the way that Nathan was beginning to recognize, the careful voice of someone who wants to be precise about something important. "I would very much like to see that property."
Dr. Clara Osei arrived in January with 2 graduate students, a camera, and the focused energy of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time without knowing exactly what it was. She was 50, precise, warm in the way that people are warm when they have genuine enthusiasm for what they do. She walked the property with Nathan, asking questions that told him she understood exactly what she was looking at even before she had looked at anything. At the eastern edge of the property, at the dry creek bed, she stopped. Nathan had marked the spot with the 3 stones Elias had described in his journal. Dr. Osei stood at those 3 stones and looked at the ground and then at Nathan. "Your great-grandfather covered this in 1944, she said. "Yes, and it's been untouched since, as far as I know." She was quiet for a moment.
Do you understand, she said, how rare that is? A site like this, undisturbed, documented, with a chain of custody going back 80 years? She shook her head. Mr. Cole, I've been doing this work for 25 years. I have never. She stopped, steadied herself. We need to do this very carefully, and we need to involve the right people from the beginning. What do you mean? I mean that this site, if it is what the Aiken document suggests, and I have every reason to believe it is, does not belong to archaeology departments or universities or you or anyone with a property deed. It belongs to a story, and that story has living heirs. She looked at him. I need to make some calls. The calls she made were to representatives of the Cherokee Nation and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, nations whose ancestors had lived in these mountains for thousands of years before the colonial period, and whose descendants had the most direct stake in what had been found on Elias Cole's 12 acres. Nathan had not fully anticipated this. He had known intellectually that the site was significant to indigenous history, but sitting in a room several weeks later, a community center in Harlan, a round table, Dr. Osei and her colleagues, and two representatives from the Eastern Band named Walter Littlefeather and Susan Morningstar, he felt the full weight of what he was holding. Walter Littlefeather was 60 years old, with a stillness that Nathan immediately recognized as the stillness of someone who has learned to carry something large with patience. Susan Morningstar was younger, perhaps 40, with the precise professional manner of someone accustomed to navigating the complicated intersection of indigenous rights and institutional systems. Nathan placed the tin box on the table. He told them everything: the journal, the letters, the document, the brass key, which he still didn't fully understand, which had no lock he had found yet. He told them about Elias, who had covered it because he didn't know what to do, about Eleanor, who had spent her life trying to find the right path, about himself, driving out to a $1 cabin on an impulse that now made complete sense. When he finished, Walter Littlefeather looked at the tin box for a long moment. "Your great-grandfather covered it," he said. "Yes. He didn't take anything. No. He didn't report it to remove it. He just covered it and marked it. Yes." Walter Littlefeather looked at Nathan. "That was a decent thing to do," he said quietly, for a man who didn't know what he was looking at. What followed was not quick, and it was not simple. The site required formal assessment. Legal frameworks around indigenous cultural heritage were complex and required careful navigation. There were conversations that were difficult, negotiations that took patience, moments where Nathan was aware that he was the newest participant in a story that was thousands of years older than his family. He learned to listen. That was the most important thing he did those months. He listened to Dr. Osei and her colleagues. He listened to Walter Littlefeather and Susan Morningstar. He read everything he could find about the history of the region, the history that existed before the coal mines, before the property deeds, before his great-grandfather's shovel struck something in a dried creek bed. He went back to the cabin again and again. He had found a contractor, a local man named Pete Harmon, 65 and semi-retired, who had grown up in Harlan County and knew old log cabin construction the way some people know languages, from the inside out. Pete walked through the cabin on their first meeting, knocked on walls, examined joists, looked at the chimney with a flashlight, and said, "She's sounder than she looks. Roof repair first. Then we can talk about the rest." "Can it be saved?" asked Nathan. Pete looked at him. "Mr. Cole, your great-grandfather built this cabin in 1941 with hand tools and timber he cut himself. The logs are American chestnut. You understand what that means. American chestnut was functionally extinct by 1950.
These are trees that don't exist anymore. The wood in these walls is irreplaceable." He paused. "You couldn't build this cabin today if you tried. All we're going to do is help it keep standing." Nathan began to work, not as a supervisor, as he had always worked before, as a laborer. He was on the roof with Pete. He was replacing insulation. He was remortaring the fireplace under Pete's instruction. He was learning at 34 what his hands were capable of when given real work to do. He moved to Harlan County, not into the cabin, not yet, the work wasn't done, but into a rented room in town. He found part-time project management consulting work he could do remotely. It was not the career he had had. It was enough. Marcus drove out on weekends sometimes, bringing Deanna and the kids. The kids ran in the woods and helped carry things and asked questions that children ask about old places. Deanna, who was a librarian, spent one entire Saturday reading Eleanor's letters and cried at the kitchen table in a way that she apologized for, and Nathan told her not to. James called every Sunday. It was during one of those Sunday calls, 6 months in, that Nathan mentioned the brass key. "I still don't know what it opens," he said. "There's nothing in the cabin. I've gone over every inch." "Have you gone over every inch of the property?" Nathan paused. "No."
He found it on a Wednesday in April, on the far northwestern edge of the property, almost entirely consumed by the forest. A stone building, small, no more than 10 by 12 feet, built from the same flat gray stone as the wall along the road. It had no windows. One door, iron, padlocked with an old lock that was rusted nearly solid. An old lock with an old keyhole. Nathan stood in the April woods with the ornate brass key in his hand and looked at the lock. The key fit. The lock, after considerable persuasion with a can of penetrating oil he'd had the foresight to bring, opened. The door swung inward. Inside was dark and dry. The stone walls had kept out the moisture remarkably well. Nathan turned on his flashlight. The building was full of wooden crates, perhaps 20 of them, stacked carefully along the walls. Some had been damaged by time, the wood of the crates themselves partially deteriorated, the contents visible through the gaps. Nathan looked at the nearest exposed contents. Books, old books, their spines faded but intact. He lifted one out carefully. It was large, leather-bound, the title pressed into the cover, Survey and Record of Land Holdings, Harlan County, Kentucky, 1887 to 1923. He lifted another, a ledger, property records, handwritten, another, and another. The crates were full of documents, records, ledgers, journals, a paper archive of extraordinary depth and age, covering, as he would eventually determine with the help of archivists from the Kentucky Historical Society, land transactions, boundary surveys, mining contracts, and community records from Harlan County spanning nearly a century. Records that had apparently disappeared. He found a letter in the last crate, sitting on top of everything else, as though placed there deliberately. It was from Elias, dated 1969, 2 years before his death. Eleanor, by the time you find this, I will likely be gone. I want to explain what is in this building, because you deserve to understand all of it. In 1941, when I built the cabin, the county clerk's office had a fire. You may have heard of this. It was before your time, but people talked about it for years. The fire destroyed many records, land records, mining contracts, deeds, documents that certain powerful men were very relieved to see destroyed because those records contained evidence of transactions that were not honest. I knew about the fire before it happened. A man I trusted told me. I could not stop it. I had no power to stop it,
But I could do one thing. I spent 3 weeks before the fire copying what I could, photographs mainly, using a borrowed camera, and I moved the originals here. Not all of them, there was not time for all of them, but the most important ones, the ones that showed what was being done to families in this county. Land taken under false pretenses, mining rights stolen, men paid less than they were owed with no record that could be checked. I put them here because I did not know what to do with them, and I was afraid. I was one man with 12 acres and a wife and a baby, and the men who would have been harmed by these records were powerful men. But I kept them because destroying them felt like the same crime as the fire. Someday someone will know what to do with them. I believe that someone is in our family. I believe they will come when the time is right. Your father, Elias. Nathan sat on the floor of the stone building in the April woods and read his great-grandfather's letter 3 times. Then he called Marcus. Marcus was quiet for a very long time. "Nathan," he said finally, "I know. He kept the originals. He kept everything. Do you understand what this means? Historical records of land fraud, mining fraud, records that were believed to have been destroyed in 1941? Nathan, this is—" I know. It took another year. The records required careful handling, conservation specialists, archivists, legal historians. The Kentucky Historical Society became involved. Investigative journalists became involved. It was a complex and careful process because the records were old and the frauds they documented were historical, the men who had committed them long dead, the companies they had worked for long dissolved or transformed. But the families of the miners and the landowners who had been cheated, those families existed. Their descendants existed. Some of them were still in Harlan County, still living with the effects of land and money and rights that had been taken from their grandparents and great-grandparents. It was not a simple resolution. Nathan had not expected a simple resolution. History rarely offers those. But things happened. A historical record was corrected. A documentary was made. A legal fund was established, modestly, carefully, to help descendants explore claims that the records made possible. Walter Littlefeather and Susan Morningstar, in conjunction with Dr. Osei and a team of careful researchers, completed an initial assessment of the site in the creek bed. The findings were significant. A formal preservation and study process was initiated, with full participation and leadership from the Eastern Band. It would take years. It would be done right. Nathan Cole was not the center of any of this. He had deliberately tried not to be. He was the one who opened the door. He was the one who brought the key. But the stories inside did not belong to him. They belonged to the people whose history they held. And he had learned in this year of listening that the most important thing you can do with something that doesn't belong to you is to give it to the people it does.
The cabin on Elias Cole's 12 acres was finished in the fall. Pete Harmon had done his work with the particular pride of a craftsman restoring something that deserved to stand. The roof was solid. The collapsed corner had been rebuilt, carefully, using salvaged timber that Pete had sourced from a collapsed barn of the same era, not identical, but close enough to honor the original. The windows were clear. The porch was level. The fireplace drew perfectly. Nathan moved in on a Saturday in October. He had almost nothing: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, the books he had collected over the year, his laptop for the consulting work, a cast-iron skillet that had been his mother's. He lit the fireplace that first night and sat in the chair closest to it and looked at the walls of the cabin his great-grandfather had built in 1941 from trees that no longer existed, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly,
not the relieved satisfaction of things working out. Something quieter, something that had to do with being in the right place, with being for the first time in years exactly where he was supposed to be. He thought about Elias, who had walked 3 days into the mountains and made something from nothing. He thought about Eleanor, who had held a secret for 60 years and trusted time to carry it forward. He thought about himself, who had been sleeping on a couch, broken and adrift, when a phone rang and an elderly attorney said, "You are the sole heir." He thought about the way things are passed down, not just property, not just secrets, something harder to name, a quality of attention, a willingness to hold things carefully and trust that the holding matters, even when you can't see why. He picked up Elias's journal. He kept it on the table now, close, and read the last entry. It was dated June 1971, 3 months before Elias died. I have lived a small life in the eyes of the world. I have not been a large man, or a famous man, or a man with power, or money, or anything that the world calls success. But I have held things. That is what I have done. I have held this land. I have held what is under it, the old story, the old bones, the old truth of who was here before us. I have held the records that powerful men wanted destroyed. I have held my wife's hand and my daughter's history and the mornings in these mountains that belong to no one and everyone. I have held things carefully and passed them forward. That is enough. I believe that is enough. If you are reading this, whoever you are, whatever part of what came after me you belong to, I want you to know that the holding was worth it. It was always worth it. Nathan closed the journal. Outside, through the clear windows that Pete Harmon had installed, the October mountains were doing what October mountains do, burning with color, red and gold and orange, the whole enormous world of them lit up like something that knows it is beautiful and is not embarrassed by it. He sat in his great-grandfather's cabin. He held things. That was enough. If this story reached something inside you, if you found yourself thinking about the things you carry without knowing you're carrying them, the history in your family that no one has told yet, the small acts of ordinary people that turn out to matter enormously, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. Inheritance of Secrets is a channel about the stories that get passed down, the hidden things, the forgotten people, the ordinary lives that contain extraordinary truths. Every story we tell here is a 10 box in a wall, a key wrapped in velvet, a letter written by someone who trusted that the right person would find it. Subscribe to Inheritance of Secrets. Hit the bell so that when the next story comes, you don't miss it, because the next one might be the one that unlocks something for you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, every life contains a secret worth inheriting. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Inheritance of Secrets.